Hello guys, welcome to the video. My name is Ali and today we're going to be talking about the state of Dark Knight and its potential moving forward. Now, before we begin the discussion, I wanted to talk a little bit about Dark Knight's history as a job in the game. So without further ado, let's begin. Now, Dark Knight, historically speaking, was a builder and spender that used to generate mana and expend it on its resources, and it was traditionally used to use the spell Dark Arts in order to empower your decision making by buffing various skills across the board. Needed more magical defense? Dark Art your Dark Mind for increased defense. Needed more attack? Dark Mind your Power Slash if you needed a stronger hit. Dark Mind your Soul Eater if you needed to recover more HP. There was a lot of different abilities you used to be able to empower with Dark Arts. And Dark Knight's playstyle back then was very consistent damage output. Dark Knight wasn't a very heavy burst class. It used to actually be very consistent in terms of damage output with a consistent resource gain and resource spending. Now, Shadowbringers Dark Knight, on the other hand, has a couple of problems in its toolkit that I believe come from the fact that Dark Knight was reworked from being a consistent damage output job to a burst damage output job. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that now Dark Knight no longer has strong resource generation, and it leads to a lot of downtime after your burst windows. Everybody knows the opener. You go Inner Delirium, 5 Blood Spillers with a couple of edges in between. You know, your CNS, throw Abyssal Drain in there if you want some more damage, and your other Plunge Charge. But that sort of playstyle of having your burst be 10 seconds and then the rest of your kit leads to a lot of downtime. Blood skills being reworked to be burst damage meant that you could no longer have the insane resource generation from Blood Weapon or from Salted Earth, or else Dark Knight would just have too much potency sitting on Blood Spiller. And on top of that, Dark Arts being reworked to a proc that's activated by the Blackest Night, but it only allows us to cast Free Edge or Flood, means that there's no longer any sort of decision making. It's just, oh, is my TBN gonna pop to give me Dark Arts? Yes. Okay, use it. No, don't use it. Spend the mana on Flood, and that's not very heavy decision making. Now, I wanted to talk about Shadowbringers Dark Knight and its balanced state across all levels, not just 80. Because despite being balanced at level 80, Dark Knight is not actually that balanced at level 50 or 60, and that's due to the lack of damage to make up for not only Stalwart Soul being all the way until level 72, unlike the other 3 tanks, and it's also due to the lack of Abyssal Drain no longer being a GCD ability that we could spend mana on, which would have further added to the decision making. Now, another problem Dark Knight faces is that before the Blackest Night, at level 70, you don't actually have an active mitigation. All you have is Shadow Wall, Rampart, your basic roll skills, and that's it. And sure, you could say that Abyssal Drain is a form of damage mitigation because of its cure ability, and that Soul Eater's cure is pretty strong. But in my opinion, it is not enough to warrant Dark Knight's lack of defensive mitigation at an early level. Because think about it, how many times have you guys been in a dungeon, you do a large pull, you throw your unleash with a flood to open up, and then what do you have? You just single target with Soul Eater to sustain yourself while using the occasional flood built up from the mana. And it's not very good for the damage mitigation department. At level 80, Dark Knight has the lowest damage of all the tanks, and a lot of people like to say, but TBN being the best mitigation skill makes up for that. And I don't believe that makes up for the fact that Dark Knight's leveling kit is so scuffed and its lack of resource generation. On top of that, current Dark Knight, Shadowbringers Dark Knight, its resource generation is so muddied by the fact that it can't be overpowered because of the whole blood spells being so strong and Edge of Shadow being so strong that it leads to a boring gameplay loop where in the first couple of seconds you open up with your Delirium, You go Blood Spiller 5 times with a couple of Floods and Shadows, and then you're left with about 80 seconds of 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 with the occasional Blood Weapon. CNS comes up every minute, so that's not that great. And on top of that, Living Dead. Living Dead is currently seen as the worst invuln in the game because it comes with some pretty big downsides. One of the main conversation topics of Living Dead is that it should have a gauge to allow healers to see how much of the Dark Knight's HP they have left to heal. But that's something that I believe they could implement in the next X-Pack. Because outside of organized parties, Living Dead is, well, not that great compared to Home Gang. Hollowed Ground is a whole nother beast. It's basically amazing. And even Super Bull-Eyed isn't as hard to deal with for healers as Living Dead is. Now, there are actually possible ways to make Shadowbringers Dark Knight more fun while retaining the current kit, believe it or not. One of those things, I believe, is that Blood Weapon should be moved to level 30 at the same time as Flood of, Darkness at level 30 is what it's called. But having these two abilities unlocked at the same level allows new Dark Knights to build mana and spend mana at the same time. It makes no sense to have to wait 5 levels to build your mana. Now, if you move Blood Weapon to level 30, you can move Edge of Shadow to level 35 to help further empower building and spending, either building and spending in AoE or building and spending in single target. But the reason we would make this change is to introduce Stalwart Soul at level 40. Now, I know a lot of people have problems with the tanks being homogenized, but in my opinion, moving Stalwart to 40 would be a good change, a good homogenization change, more towards standardizing all 4 tanks. Because it doesn't make sense that the other 3 tanks have both of their AoE combos at level 40, but Dark Knight has to wait until level 72 to get its ability. This ability at an earlier level would help it generate the resource and damage that it needs to make up for its lack of active mitigation before level 70. Another ability, I believe, I don't know if you've noticed, but Dark Knight has a hole in its leveling kit. Look at this. 52, 54, 56. Where's your 58 ability? You know what that hole could be filled with? Dark Missionary. Dark Missionary, I believe, should be introduced at level 58 on a much longer cooldown, let's say 180 seconds for balance reasons. But the point of moving it up is to allow new Dark Knight players to learn how to start mitigating raid-wide AoE damage. Raid-wide AoEs are very important to learn how to mitigate with your abilities, and Dark Knight doesn't have any party utility aside from the Blackest Night at level 70. That would be a good change in my opinion. Now, another change that should happen, I believe, is the mana generated by Delirium should be increased, because it makes no sense for a 90-second ability to generate, if you use it 5 times, you're only generating 200 mana per Blood Spiller and 500 per Quietus. What does that mean? It means that every 90 seconds you either get 2500 mana if you get to squeeze all 5 in, or a measly 1000 in single target. And that level of generation, of resource generation, for Delirium, very low, very low. Carve and Spit needs to have its cooldown either reduced or its mana increased to 1200, because getting 600 mana per minute is pretty bad for the resource generation tank. Now, I know all of these, all these changes might lead to too much damage, so if Blood Spiller and Quietus need to get their potencies nerfed, I believe Blood Spiller maybe is the culprit here. That should get its potency nerfed, possibly slightly, but that's another thing, that's for balance reasons. With Dark Knight having the lowest damage, I don't think that might be necessary. Now, as for the future of Dark Knight, there are some pretty good changes that could be made to the current kit. For example, reintegrating Dark Arts into the kit the way, Heavensward used to. For example, allowing maybe you can use Carve and Spit to restore double the mana, or allowing you to use it on Dark Mind once again to increase the magic resistance to maybe 40%. Allowing Dark Arts to once again integrate with Quietus to restore mana, allowing Dark Arts to empower Soul Eater to become a direct critical hit, things like this. Dark Arts was an integral part of Dark Knight's identity, of its gameplay identity, and having that strip to just be a free spender doesn't really do it justice because, like I said, lack of decision making. I believe that Shadow Skin, the old ability from Heavensward that was just a simple defensive buff, should be introduced as sort of like a baby Blackest Night, where it's maybe like 15% barrier, 1500 mana cost, but it would refund your mana if it pops. This is a good way to teach new Dark Knight users how to mitigate with their Blackest Night, but the baby version, so that by the time they unlock it at level 70 and it upgrades to Blackest Night via a trait, Dark Knight players will already have had experience, but they will now have a more powerful shield to work with for the more powerful content. Reintroducing Abyssal Drain as a mana spender is, in my opinion, one of the key things that needs to happen for this job. Not only will it add variance, because whenever you use Flood or Edge, you proc it for Dark Side, but reintroducing Abyssal Drain needs to happen as a mana spender, not only to add variance, but to help the sustain of Dark Knight. But the thing is, it should be just as powerful as Flood of Darkness in AoE, and it should be just as powerful as Edge of Darkness or Shadow in single target. So I think that maybe they could all upgrade via level 74 trait. Abyssal Drain could get a potency increase to match those guys. And Dark Arts should also make Abyssal Drain free. That would be a really nice thing to add. Now, another hole in the kit that should be fixed, Salted Earth. Salted Earth is one of the few ground AoEs and one of the few abilities that Dark Knights have that's pretty unique. And it's a pretty historically awesome skill. It used to be on a much longer duration on a shorter cooldown, but the current version doesn't generate any blood. It doesn't have any interaction with the kit. So that should return, in my opinion. It should be allowed to generate blood once again, to tie the blood resource back into the job. As for Delirium, it should definitely be reworked, and it should be a resource skill that ties blood and mana together once again. Back in the day, Delirium used to convert blood into mana, which you could convert mana into damage, and then you could also use blood price to convert damage into mana, but you could also convert damage into blood via your abilities, with Soul Eater, things like that, Stalwart Soul generating blood. Blood skills shouldn't be used for burst damage. In my opinion, having them be used for consistent damage would be a much wiser use of their power, because it doesn't really allow Dark Knight to build, like I said earlier. If the blood skills are too powerful, if Edge and Flood and I guess Abyssal Drain, if they're too powerful, it might lead to the same problem we have in Shadowbringers, where our resource generation must be sort of curtailed in order to not make Dark Knight go crazy. But then if we remove these as the burst damage, what will we have for burst damage? I believe that Living Shadow, being at a 120-second cooldown on top of that, is the perfect way to give Dark Knight some extra burst damage. Perhaps you can have Esteem copy our rotation 1-for-1, so that you can essentially double Dark Knight's damage output every 120 seconds. Now that might be a little too much. Maybe you'd have to balance it out. But I believe that at the moment, this glorified damage over time ability has the potential to become the burst damage skill that Dark Knight needs. Well, as for my concluding thoughts, I believe that the Shadowbringers job developer team needs to hire somebody who is a tank job developer, because the lack of having a dedicated tank dev has led to the problems that we're seeing with the current Dark Knight build. And it would, none of these problems may have happened if we had a dedicated developer. And for a game that has 20 million active users, only having 4 developers that don't even play tanks or healers, it's not really a good thing. Now, in my opinion, all tanks, I don't know why Square Enix has this philosophy that tanks need to be damage sponges that don't do any sort of damage themselves, but back in Stormblood and even in Heavensward, tanks used to do a lot of damage overall. And I think that tanks should be allowed to deal more damage than they currently do. Perhaps with the changes to Dark Knight in the future, maybe you can upgrade warrior's, storm buff to be 15 or 20%. Maybe you can extend the duration of fight or flight and requiescat windows to give paladin some more damage. Maybe Gunbreaker could use 5 cartridges, to give it some more damage. Gunbreaker is an interesting thing, actually. I want a little side note on Gunbreaker. I used to believe that it was a tank that was designed during the Stormblood era, and then they decided not to touch it to make it like nice and strong on release. But a forum poster said something that really made me think about Gunbreaker in a different light. She said that Dark Knight to her, that Gunbreaker to her felt like it was originally meant to be a maiming DPS to compete with Dragoon, but then at last minute they changed it into a tank, and that kind of explains why, personally, I feel like Gunbreaker doesn't really have any weight to its cooldowns, unlike, Paladin and Dark Knight that have to trade off resource to use their tanking abilities. Dark Knight doesn't really have to. Now, Warrior doesn't have to either, but so maybe my argument is kind of flawed. But I do believe that that Gunbreaker should be allowed to generate like, a couple extra cartridges, but to have both Heart of Stone and Aurora cost a cartridge to sort of add some of that tank-like decision making. A new tank may want to save their cartridges for their defensive abilities, but a more experienced tank who has the hang of the fight already can decide, I'm going to expend these cartridges for more damage, and then that would increase Gunbreaker's overall damage. Just some ideas I had. Well, that's the end of the video, guys. Thanks for watching. Now, of course, some of the thoughts I have on Dark Knight 2 are shared by people on the official forums, but the lack of, people talking about the problems of Dark Knight, and Dark Knight is being used as the poster boy of the expansion, so in my opinion, Dark Knight should have a lot of these problems fixed. A lot of its problems come from its bad leveling kit placement. Abyssal Drain right now desperately needs at least a second charge to make it, a little more useful in dungeon pulls. Either that or, like Carven Spit, reduce the cooldown on each of these but to 30 seconds so they can be used more often. Things like these, nobody's really talking about these because, like everybody keeps saying, all tanks are balanced at level 80. But if they're not balanced at level 70, 60, or 50, and if they're not fun to play, then what's the point, right? Well, that's all I've got to say for today. Thanks for listening, guys. I'm going to be putting out a video in the future on my current thoughts on Scholar and its state. So, that's it for today. Thanks for listening, and I hope you guys stay safe. Take care. Peace.